Small wall screeching from Vienna. Hi, welcome back to the next talk in room 1 on the last day of the Privacy Week. And if you have a profound activist and expert on digital matters here, Kuchen, who has not just dealt with the chaos in schools, but also digital legislation, in particular because governments like to say, yeah, we do digitalization now, we will be hip and modern, and with that actually is reflected in the laws and how these procedures work. That's what we'll hear about now. So, welcome to Kuchen. Okay, I'll be speaking German this year. I tried English last year. So basically today will be about 2 laws from the legislative period which dealt with digital issues but didn't quite do well. One of these has come into law from January and the other one was avoided. And I've got some theoretical approaches and remarks and an extract from the 19th century that is quite a good fit. So basically, we'll start. Attention, attention, we are entering the new territory. And why does the new territory need laws? Because it's not a space that is void of laws, which has been a long, long debate. We've had this rechtsfreier Raum, space void of laws term that Angela Merkel gave us. There are laws that apply on the internet. That is something we should all realize. In theory, laws that are not made for the digital area still apply in the digital area. So are there actually any differences here? Opinions vary. As a computer scientist with a social science background, I have to say, yes, there are differences. Digital systems do work differently. They have a different size, different issues, different challenges. And for the legislator, it gets interesting mostly when the legislator thinks that you can do the very same thing that you do in the non-digital area. And we keep seeing this. Things work differently in the digital space. So how much control does the legislator have over the internet depends on the legislator. The Austrian legislator has much less control than, say, the US legislator has, because a lot of the infrastructure that make up the internet more or less come from the US. Why do we actually need analog laws for digital issues? That's another issue, another question that we'll come to. I have a few characters that will lead us through the talk. First, the federal law about diligence and responsibility on the net. It sounds as complicated as it is. It's one of these nice hatred on the internet laws. And I'll just forewarn you, there are good reasons why this law wasn't pursued any further and didn't come into force. It seems like it will not be implemented. You can hope. It was called the digital prohibition of masking. And the ban on wearing masks. So there were. It was touted as the panacea against hatred on the internet, and I'd like to look at what really happens and how this differs from the way that they wanted it to be. And if you look at what's there, short outline, the law wants to establish an obligation to use real names by saying that people that run internet forums from a certain size, which with interesting metrics there, but that's not that relevant. They should store from all users what their names are and where they live, so that these users could be sued if necessary. And there's a threat of fines to the platforms, which will be interesting and which we'll come to later. And we wrote an opinion about this, which you can find on the ministry's website and on the Chaos Certificate website, I think. And the issue, again, is how do you treat hatred? We try to take this apart because it doesn't quite work as they believe it can work. And there were lots of press reports. The international press also talked about it. Netzpolitik.org, of course, took it up, which is the go-to medium in this area. And then we saw in Austria, if the Germans get excited about our issues, then it gets a certain reach. If only we talk about it, it tends to disappear. So that perhaps is the reason why the law wasn't seriously pursued, because German media got interested. Then we have the other law, the other main actor, the main character, the digital tax, digital control law of 2020. It's kind of there's a customs thing, there's a something about ads in the digital area. It is about tax, so that there is an existing tax already, but in its existing form, it cannot be. It's hard to measure, to find a measure to base the tax on. Now that has been enacted, and with, as they say, certain improvements regarding privacy. Ultimately, the accusation or the critique was that there is an implicit data retention for all kinds of internet access as a consequence of this law. And we'll see why this is. But it will come into force on the 1st of January with assurances that it will be anonymous, which didn't actually make it into the letter of the law, but will be part of the implementation guidelines. We'll have to look, and my fear is that it will not work. Well, that is the digital tax law, which, again, we commented upon. Epicenter Works we did. This is the Epicenter Works thing is an article on their website, but they criticized it as well, and it went through. And there's an article in the standard paper that says, it should be anonymized. We just want to tax the big corporations. If it's going to work that well, we'll have to see, and we will look at this. So the new territories should know that the law is your friend and your helper. So we'll just think about it. How do we get to a point where a law is required? Starting from the assumption that the internet is not a space void of laws, it works. And then we see, well, there are some problems. And with these problems, something has to be done. Otherwise, we have another problem, perhaps. And the first step is, and this is why I put it down, and the first issue is that describing a problem sometimes is a problem in itself. The way a problem is perceived and described often is the factor that makes laws lack sensibility or effectiveness, or even gets things worse with the new law. So the description of the problem often is the start where things explode. And it always depends on who decides what is a problem and what isn't a problem. And for that, it's often ministries that take these decisions, and that leads to these laws having a strange kind of focus. And then we have this short extract from design theory. The problem description and the solution cannot really be separated. They quite work hand in hand, because the way I describe the problem almost always sketches the solution that I have in mind. And you see this in legislation quite easily, quite immediately. And let's remember that when these laws appear, the question is, which perspective is this written from? Who says that it's a problem? And why are they finding this particular solution? And that often leads to quite interesting insights. So one problem, the law about diligence and reason on the net, the internet, the hatred law. Of course, the internet has all kinds of options of accusing people and without consequence, because it's all anonymous. That was the problem description. And because what is anonymous is when the law thinks people insult each other because it's anonymous, there's no consequences because it's anonymous, you need to identify a person to avoid the problem, and so on and so on. And mostly all that is simply not true. This is not my problem description, it's the one that the law used. And legally, these consequences, of course, have to go to the courts, which is the instance to negotiate these issues in a democracy. And the crimes of insult on honor. Yeah, insult on honor and reputation damage, and so an important step is to solve the problem. We have to know whom we can sue, and that, of course, then leads to the law. Next page, the digital tax. Well, this is about large corporations, Facebook, Google, Amazon, whoever, hardly pay any tax or very little at all in Austria and generally in Europe. A few years ago, there was a wave of news about this. I think it was Starbucks that paid 4,000 euros per year in Europe. That's when it started for me. And that, of course, is something we all agree that should be considered and as a problem. The next step then is, even if the company has a profit, makes profits in Austria, they are mostly taxed abroad. And in the digital space, it is much harder, because you have to register what profits are made in Austria, which profits in other EU states, and which profits somewhere else entirely. So the foundation for measuring that makes it hard to get a tax on it. So you have to say what the amount is that you base the tax on. And through that, there is this issue with tax in the digital area. And compared to regular tax havens, you have even more of an issue. Even with tax havens in other areas, they are causing huge problems, and escaping tax by going to other countries is something that takes a lot of work, and there is an enticement to create a new law. Right.
Okay. So, after best knowledge and conscience. So now we have the problems identified, and we just have to solve them. This can be easily done by law, right? So, okay. So is the digital tax the solution? So now we have an assessment basis. Okay, but we don't have one, so we create one. What could be an assessment basis for the digital tax? And we'll look into this, how it is done exactly. And what suddenly happens there, we see that no one really thought about that, and they just start, getting everything, collecting everything. So when you show an ad on the internet, the company which bought the app, they know into which country it goes, and that is via the IP address. And now if you have $30 billion that Facebook gets bought per year by ads, we can then say how many of those have been sent to Austria because we have the IP address. And this will be an assessment base, and then we have it, and they can say they will pay 5% tax for this. IP addresses, that's a difficult topic about privacy, because actually they may be personal identifiable data, but in criminal cases they don't treat them as personal identifiable information. But, with enough research, you can map IP addresses to a person, at least approximately, which may not be enough for criminal cases, but it's enough for civilians. Additionally, and we will talk about this later in detail, when they serve ads, they also store an ID, kind of ID. So when you're nagging those companies that are doing ads, you will actually get those IDs, and then you get a much more clear identifier. And those allow tax-relevant issues or payments. And so that means in Austria, according to contract law, you have to store those for 7 to 20 years. 7 to 10 years, sorry, rather. And so in most cases, most people who fall under this under this law will have to do it for 10 years. So this is the main paragraph, the key paragraph of this law, which says what are online ads, so what's the defining principle that they are done in Austria. So that's about the IP address is geolocated in Austria. Well, yeah, but it's actually pretty difficult to assign IPs to countries because that changes a lot. And the person who has to pay taxes has to store it for every single ad. So all the details about this ad. What the length of the storage, we'll look into it later. But every time an ad is issued, you have to record it. That is legally binding for the tax reasons. So the other law we talked about, which was about harassment on the internet. Well, what do you need to sue people? We need their address and their name. So that we can send them documents that they're going to be taken to court. So now, just anywhere where people may harass or insult others, the provider of the network has to identify all people which register there beforehand, because and the reason is they say, well, in the real world quotes, it's the same thing. Which is kind of difficult, because actually in the real world it's not like that. So if I'm standing here and insult you, you actually don't know where I live and what my real name is. So this is kind of not really true in the real world. And so now we go to the important paragraphs here. So you need so all those providers need name and address of anyone who registers. And whenever someone says, I want to sue this and that person, because that is definitely an insult over there, so a legally relevant insult, And then the following things have to be given to the person who wants to sue. Here you have the list. So suddenly that's a problem that leads to your actual names having to be used on the internet, just by shortcut, more or less. The point that's problematic here is that if as a provider you don't follow those rules, you will have to pay fines. So if you not give the data to people who want to sue, you have to pay fines. But there's no defined procedure what to do if the request is obviously bullshit. There are no fines for people who request others' data and just want to abuse this possibility. And the fines are pretty high for the providers. So I am asking here pretty obviously how. So whenever a provider gets more than one request per day, how likely will they will they really check it if this request is justified? So because as they get fines if they retain the data, but they don't get fines if they give it away without reason, it's clear what they are going to do. So this is actually a way you can, well, it's a legal instrument you can abuse to find, well, the addresses and names of people from the internet and do with it whatever you want. Because one more point is there's no obligation that you have to sue someone after getting the data. It just says that if you suspect that you may have to can be able to sue someone, you can already do such a request. So that's pretty questionable. Okay. So then, paragraph 42, once upon a time, privacy land.
So we go back to the year 1890 now, and this is about similar text in law, which for the first time defined the concept of privacy in the legal area, and that is in a paper from Brandeis and Warren, these two gentlemen down there, and one of these was in the Supreme Court for a while, for a few years. And to me, this is kind of interesting because you notice what the motivations and the problems were at the time. And of course, this is all way before the digital era, but this is where the word privacy really received meaning in law. And broadly speaking, these old gentlemen had the problem that the media suddenly earn money by writing things that should not be released into the public, as they thought. For example, gossip, all kinds of things, but also the business models. These people's business models were damaged by the media writing about them. So people get excited about something, and it's all about money, and it's just not on that you can't earn money in America. So the funny thing is to find where these things come from. I have an extract from the text. So it's, of course, it's 130 years old, but therefore it's written in a very interesting way. It sounds more like a sermon than a treatise in legal science. There is no doubt that this is indecent and the process overstepping in every direction the obvious bounds of propriety and of decency. Yeah, so it's about the press earning money by people doing nonsense. So these are the shoulders we stand on when we get angry about privacy, right? Sorry. It's not all bad, but there are many concepts involved that we can still use today. If we ignore the initial reasoning, it's quite logical, and to define what should get dragged into the public and what should not. But it started with them losing money and getting angry about that. And yes, there are damages that are outside financial issues, but that doesn't quite fit the problem setting, which was then also not part of the solution at the time. And what also has to be said is that this idea that privacy is a right to protect property, that has kind of survived until today in current legislation and jurisdiction, not as the main reason, but if you really want to go through the courts, you often have to prove a financial kind of damage, or damage that at least is psychological, and then sue for that. For example, the big GDPR thing, that if we didn't have a law where warnings as fines would be okay, then we would have a problem to get these issues fought through in court, because the issue still is, if you haven't had a damage and you can't prove it, why are you getting annoyed? So you have to be careful where these things come from. It's not all bad, though, and it has adapted to the times. So we had the privacy as something which is opposite the media's interests, and then we get into libertarianism, where privacy is defined as defenses against the state, and in the digital time you more get to privacy being a defense against corporations. So media and corporations I would define as not the same thing, because media are there to kind of serve the public and corporations serve their own interests, although there's of course an overlap. So as a kind of overview, what the problem setting was and is, and how this leads to certain solutions. Right. Now, part 4.
Okay. So part of this information could make people nervous in the population. So now we look at technical and legal realities. We looked a lot on laws now, and we thought, okay, so what's the legal idea behind this? But also the problem is, and which we see a lot together, is that there are technical systems, and those have they have to run under certain rules. So technical and legal realities don't look at the problem the same way. So how you can actually implement it is many times pretty difficult. So for example, the digital tax, it's pretty hard to how you can actually implement this law in tech, because there are rules that you can set in technical systems, and just like code as law, maybe here the buzzword. You also have this idea that technical changes have changed the scope of laws, and may even destroy all the laws, or so you do have laws and systems and technical systems which just thwart given laws at the current time. Because sometimes even the technical systems actually want to destroy current things, like looking at cryptocurrencies, which have a clear aim at destroying the bank system. So, and this is often very deeply included in some tech systems. So that we have this opposite of saying code is law. which is a pretty difficult subject to talk about, especially in law and in legislation, of course. Because on the other hand, legislators think that they want to change technology by law, and then you have tech people who think that we just write code and we don't need law for that, or we have code that is more important than law. So you have pretty clear ideological differences between law people and tech people here. And currently they are in a kind of balance, but this could become unbalanced pretty quickly. And this is something I see more and more in legislation as well, and that has to be thought about in legislation more and more. So who actually has the power to implement it and change laws? So what can go wrong? So this is digital. This is about this is a graphics that I think about had for 10 years. So this is the 200 milliseconds that it takes until you get an ad served. This is also why the digital tax doesn't work as intended. It doesn't really matter what's on the slide, but the point is that you see, first step is some person clicks on some URL and the website knows, oh, this person is going to come to my website. I could also give them an ad. I serve them an ad. And whenever we click on this website, in such media which uses this kind of thing, which are most media today, then they think about, okay, that the website starts finding out who is this person, what do I know about this person, where have I seen this person before, okay. When I have all this data, that's the profile of the person. Dear advertisers, here you see the profile. How much do I get for this profile? So in this 200 milliseconds, you have a bidding of your eyes. So the website makes a bid offers your eyeballs for bids for advertisers. And this happens every single time on every website. And each profile has another value for each time, and there may be a different advertiser, there may be another incentive why an advertiser pays for this profile. So it depends on how much advertisements are served in general on a website, but usually they are hundreds. So you have a lot of ad placements. And this is actually the idea of the digital tax. So they think that this is something that is as complicated as a contract, but the advertisers are much farther. They are very quickly. They say, okay, every second is a new ad possibility, and so each of those ad placements must be stored and retained, because there may be another advertiser, there may be another reason for this advertiser purchasing it, etc. And that is, well, a lot of data actually. On the one hand side, and on the other side, it's pretty relevant for privacy, because of course the ads are served by profile. So from all the ads that may be, so when you see those ads that have been shown to a person, you may get can work out what kind of person watched those ads. And I think the problem is that when people are not going to think about this, but the easiest solution is that they just store everything with terabytes of metadata, so about which advertisements were served at which second to which profile. And this is actually data pretension. Oh, and one funny thing about that is I don't think that anyone at the financial institutions will look at this data. Maybe they will find some automated tools if the data is in a good format, but I think if this is really what is going to be realized, no one in the financial institutions will be able to look at this amount of data. But I think who is going to look into this? Maybe police or criminal courts. So that is actually something that is not relevant for the financial institutions because it's just work for them and a lot of work. But for civilians, it's a great step forward. So we have to ask: is this good? Is this for financial institutions or for state surveillance? So collecting data in an immense amount. The question about if you have a big company with terabytes of data and they actually have to think about this, get out of this data, what has been served to Austria, this is still something it's pretty difficult to implement and to check. You cannot check whether the companies give you the right data, and they won't care. And if there are not many countries implementing this, like a group of countries like the European Union, you will have the problem that numbers won't be correct because there's no way to prove that the numbers are incorrect, or you would need incredible amount of forensics work to check the numbers. So solutions in this area are not really useful on a national basis. You have to do it over like global institutions. So, and for me, so is this already cyberpunk? It's a question for me. Is this something where the companies have more power than the states? And if we are at that point, we can say, well, we can actually delete the states and don't care for countries. I mean, maybe that's a bit far-fetched, but it's developing in this direction because there are no possible solutions on a national scale, no usable solutions on a national scale. And this thing is now law. It's law that is implemented and that has to be, and we will just look and see it getting shipwrecked at some point. Next point. So like
the rename obligation, we don't have that yet, but what I've just briefly outlined is that what this does, if you can get an address by having someone's name, say you are trying about libel, and then you have a very easy means to perform doxing. I'll just post addresses of people I don't like on the internet, and then things happen like in the US when the SWAT is called, a special team by the police saying, oh, these people are holding someone hostage, and because the address is public, these people may then be shot by the police without any crime actually having occurred because of some false accusations. That has happened, and that is the threat. If you just post addresses on the internet or throw them out onto the internet, and that is what you do with this law, otherwise you would have protections in the law saying, well, the people that abuse this kind of thing will be punished. No, we don't have that. So if they don't get punished, then we simply cause data to be thrown out onto the internet, and we're threatening lives. I would really say that. So what happens is that freedoms are restricted. You have to give someone your name and address before you're able to speak out. There's another hurdle. You know from usability research that if it takes more than 10 seconds to post something, you won't do it. So name and address checks. How is the company supposed to do this? Right. And ultimately, the threat is that data protection is ignored, and this kind of behavior is financially enticed. So this went very wrong indeed. Lessons learned. What is going wrong? sometimes the worst solutions are intentional. So this hatred speech law, I would assume, was given these loopholes intentionally, because this came from an interior ministry which at the time was controlled by the right-wing FPÖ party, and they were really interested in phishing names and addresses from the internet, and I think that was part of the motivation. Often politics lack technical understanding, simply because this complicated way that ad technology works is not something that anyone who is not earning money with this wants to look at. It's really strenuous, and solving international problems nationally is very hard anyway, because there are corporations, international ones, under different legislations, and then you have things like Brexit happening. States don't want to be told what to do either, and that makes things more problematic. And this situation is just shamelessly exploited. That's why something as weak as safe harbor was in fact for such a long time, because I was really interested in not having to care. So not every solution is equally good. Some are simply wrong, bad, damaging to people, and you have to take note of this. And motivations are often ignored or packaged into conspiracy theories. What I said about the Interior Ministry, you could consider a conspiracy theory as well. So it's a different, difficult balance, and motivations are often completely ignored during the expert hearing stage or over-exaggerated. What could be improved? More understanding of technology in legislation. We have to explain to legislators how technology works. We still haven't managed to communicate effectively how technology works. And particularly in legislation, it's important to say we support. We don't just criticize, we also support. One of the most important issues I came across is that we shouldn't just say, oh, this is shit, but also, how could it be improved? And then there is the issue that, particularly in software development, but all in technology, there is very little thought about impacts. And if you want to prevent bad legislation, you write software that doesn't need laws that could make everything worse. So to think yourself how you deal with technology impacts and restrict those and limit those, mitigate them, that is an important step towards having good digital legislation, because otherwise it will go wrong. And also be aware of politics, become political, see what's going wrong, because the things that go wrong in legislation are often there because of some political intention, and this is often not very well connected to technology. So finding solutions that technologically and politically and legally make sense, that is what needs to be done. Right. And that gets me to the end. Are there any questions?
Okay, so we do have a microphone in the room. Are there any questions? Okay. No, currently not. Was that a half-raised hand? Yeah? No? Maybe? Okay. Well, and how far have the people who are in finance and in financial institutions who have to control those digital tech thing, how far have they been involved in the legislation in this case for the digital tax? Do you know that?
Well, the digital tax law, in theory, originated at the Chancellery, but to my knowledge, the finance ministry or finance administration was involved even before, There were intense discussions, and because the international pursuit of tax evasion is such a big issue, particularly in the finance world, they are behind this, and I think they are one of the people behind this law, although it has huge gaps. But that's the reason why probably it was enacted and passed. So that is the impression I had gained.
Thanks a lot. Okay, because in my experience, which isn't that big, but still, it's often a problem that the people at the base who have to work with such legislation are not included in legislation.
Yeah, well, this law is not about the huge cases. You have to make at least 10 millions of takings before you are affected in these things. Several millions of ad revenue as a foundation, as a condition.
Any further questions? No, sad. Okay. Then again, a great applause for Kuchen, please.